This is our last session of the conference, and Poonam had decided to keep the best one for the last. And you can guess why I say this is the best one. I shall not say it myself. This is a session where we will have a keynote address by our esteemed guest, Martin Wolf, on the world in polycrisis. That will be about 30 minutes. Then we will have some discussion around the remarks that Martin will make. Our panelists here, very, very distinguished, Montek and Ananth. They will comment, and then we will see how far we carry on the discussion on polycrisis. Maybe that will fill the entire session. If not, and Martin and panelists permit, we might get into some discussion of India as well. None of our speakers really needs any introduction at all, but I should say at least a few words on our esteemed guest here, Martin Wolf, the keynote speaker. Again, he is not someone who needs an introduction, but I just need to give one. Martin Wolf is associate editor and chief economic commentator at the Financial Times London. Martin has two identities, one of economist and one of journalist, and it is often difficult to gauge whether he is a better economist than he is journalist or better journalist than he is economist. He is certainly extremely distinguished, both as an economist and as a journalist. Several universities have bestowed honorary degrees on him, so I assume that that can't be only for journalism. It has to be for his penetrating writings on economics. There are institutions in UK, such as London School of Economics, in Australia, in Belgium, who have bestowed these honorary degrees on him. In journalism, Martin has won every prize that is worth winning. If there is a prize he has not won, then it is really not worth winning. There are just simply too many here. I will let you read from the bio that appears here in the booklet that has been circulated to you. With that, I think we will begin. There is no point losing time. We are here to hear Martin, and so Martin, floor is yours. The world in polycrisis.
So I think that the response to that very nice introduction is I show the advantages of non-specialization, in that it's quite good to be mediocre at two things at the same time when people find it difficult to achieve that level in two at the same time. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think the last time I addressed NCAER was for the C.D. Deschmuck lecture in 2019. Quite a lot has happened since then, which probably fits into my broad thesis. I am aware that I have the graveyard shift in a conference. So first of all, you're all very tired, and you're thinking about your dinner. Presumably I was given this because the organized hope that I will keep you awake. I will do my best. That's all I can say. What I can certainly say is what I will offer is as close to being the perfectly orthogonal lecture to the previous one that you can imagine. If that was extraordinarily detailed, specific and focused, this is ludicrously broad, intellectually disreputable, statistically disgraceful, but it does talk about some pretty important subjects, namely what's going on in the world. And I've decided, after some thinking about it, because I really rather dislike it, to use this word polycrisis. I dislike it partly because I don't like these sorts of neologisms invented from Greek, and partly because Adam Tooze uses it. But nonetheless, I think it's quite useful, because never, at least in my life, have so many different crises originated from so many different areas of activity in the world. So it seems to me that it's not a bad way of thinking about it. So I'll start off by talking about what a polycrisis is, and the Cascade Institute in Canada is quite well known for its work in this area, and I think it gets it fairly well. A global polycrisis occurs when crises in multiple global systems become causally entangled in ways that significantly degrade humanity's prospects. And I think that's a sort of not unreasonable description of where we might be. I'll come to that later. And I'm going to follow this with what I think is the best statement on uncertainty and how to respond to it by the cleverest human being who ever lived, in my view. And he wasn't an economist. And it is, of course, and you can read it, if it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. In other words, we really don't know what's going to happen, but we can make some guesses, and we better be prepared if it happens. Now, with that introduction, let me just outline what I intend to cover. I intend to think about what's going on in the world in three obviously overlapping but distinct categories. I found this quite a useful way of organizing my thoughts about what's going on in the world. And the three categories are, first, big long-term trend shifts in the environment. So I call them shifts, and I use that term, it was quite useful in writing my book on the financial crisis, and there are going to be 5 of them. And the second category I'm going to talk about are the shocks that are now ongoing, basically the shocks of the last 4 years, 3 or 4 years, starting with the pandemic. We have been living in a few years with an exceptionally large number of pretty large shocks, all coming together and interacting. And the last thing I'm going to talk about are the fragilities in the world system on which these shifts and shocks are working, or perhaps one might say in their response, they are not working. And with that introduction, I'm going to talk about some scenarios for the future. So I have no idea what's going to happen, but I'm going to put down some possible scenarios which might be worth thinking about. I'm not going to tell you about the probabilities of these scenarios unless you push me very, very hard. Well, I might a bit. And then finally, in one outrageously brief last slide, I'm going to talk about what this might mean for what most of you really care about, which is India. So that's what I'm going to do. So let's start with the shifts. What I'm going to look at are, as I said, long-term changing trends in the world. I'm going to talk about demography. This is, as I said, ridiculously broad brush. But then I'm a journalist and don't need intellectual respectability. The second is the pretty obvious point, the rise of the East, and above all, the rise of China. And possibly in future, the rise of India, but I'm not going to explore that until the end. What is sometimes called de-globalisation, and I think can be better referred to by this hideous neologism, slowbalisation. But it's quite an important shift, which I'll discuss. I'm going to talk about climate change, and I'm going to talk about technological change. These are the things you have to have in the back of your mind if you think what's going on. And none of these is likely to change in the rest of at least the lifetimes of people of my age. So let's start with demography. And here the most obvious point, there are two. The first is the population balance of the world is shifting dramatically away from the high-income countries, particularly towards sub-Saharan Africa. I will come to that in a moment. Population seems likely to continue to be much the fastest in relatively poor countries. Very important point. By 2050, on these projections, which are the median projections from the UN of a couple of years ago, the populations of current high-income countries plus China will be just 28% of the world total, which is not that much larger than the 22% share forecast by the UN for sub-Saharan Africa. And according to their forecasts, slightly over half of the increase in the world population of the next 30 years will be in sub-Saharan Africa, and the rest will be in Asia, and most of that will be here. So that's demography as population shares. And the high-income countries will continue to shrink, but not dramatically on these projections, from 16 to 14% of the total. The second thing that obviously is crucial is the divergence of aging across the world. Here I've just gone up to 2018. I don't want to get into forecasts because it doesn't matter dramatically. And this just shows the staggering divergence across the world in the aging process, and particularly the proportion of those aged 65 to those aged 15 to 64. And if you go across, you look at countries like Japan, and the lighter line, the lighter column at the right is the percentage point change. Spain, the Eurozone, Germany, France. It's really dramatic. It's spectacularly dramatic how big the shift is. It's pretty large in Canada, the UK, US. China over this period will age significantly, but not yet. The forecasts here reach developed country levels in that time period, but they certainly will in the second half of the 21st century. And on the current forecasts, the exceptions will be sub-Saharan Africa and India. So not only was this where the population growth is the fastest, but of course this has profound implications for population structure. And this, to give you one example of the implication of all this, it is pretty obvious, as I like to tell my European friends, on the days when I'm not part of Europe, but of course on all the other days, that there is going to be simply staggering migration pressure from the south to Europe. That's just self-evident, and they don't want to think about it at all. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the rise of the East. I've got a couple of charts. This one in PPP and one of nominal GDP. These are IMF data. And basically what you're seeing here, if we just start in 2004, between 2004 and 2024, the share of the developed countries in world nominal GDP will have fallen by 20 percentage points. And that's really pretty dramatic. And nearly all, though not quite all, of the counterpart of that is, over that period, China, which is the great big brown block. You can also see there is an increase in the Indian share, which is the light gray block just above it. But today, developing and emerging countries basically now account for 60% of nominal GDP. Of course, it's much higher at PPP. And the second thing I wanted to show, which is that despite this dramatic shift, this is again shares of GDP, but this time at purchase power parity, and here I'm dividing the world in a different way between the US and its Western high-income allies. I've left India out of this, too controversial. So I've put in the US and its allies at the bottom and China, Russia at the top. And you can obviously see that between 2000 and 2022, China, Russia, basically all China, have increased in size dramatically at PPP. and then the US and its allies are basically much the same size. US, sorry, is much the same size. Nonetheless, at least in 2022, the GDP at purchasing power parity of the US and its allies is about double that of China, Russia. And if you look at most indices of military power and so forth, that continues to be the case. So we're in relative decline, but it's probably still the biggest power bloc economically and otherwise in the world, and likely to remain so, I think, for some substantial time. So that's the second shift. Now the third is what I've called globalization, de-globalisation, which is wrong, or slowbalisation. I could spend an hour discussing the multiple dimensions of globalization and de-globalisation, and this applies only to trade in goods, which is what most people focus on. But if you look at trade in services, movement of data, movement of capital, movement of people, it's all different. And even here, I'm simplifying dramatically, but nonetheless, I think it tells a pretty powerful story. And this chart goes back to 1820. So basically what it shows is there have been two great periods of increased integration of the world economy. The late 19th and early 20th century ended with the First World War. And then after the Second World War, a modest increase up to 1980, roughly 1990, and then this colossal period of expansion after the fall of the Soviet Union, reaching an all-time peak. Most other measures of globalization show a similar pattern. The one that might surprise you most is the movement of people. Relative to the world's population, the movement of people seems to have been greatest in the late 19th and early 20th century, by at least 3 times. It's quite something that most people are not aware of. But in most other dimensions, and certainly movement of data, movement of even financial flows, gross, a little bit less net. We reached an absolute peak at the time of the global financial crisis. It has been declining since then, but not dramatically. In other words, we are not integrating more in goods, and that is consistent with what we've seen in finance, but less true of services, but the impulse to increase globalization has halted. One of the things most people don't know, and I'll just mention this, is the biggest factor in the decline, and this is actually the decline of the trade openness of China. I think very few people seem to know this. China has become a normal superpower in its trade ratios from being like South Korea. But it's not the only thing that is driving this. So we're moving to a period when we're not integrating, but we're not radically disintegrating yet. And a key question is where that goes now. And that depends, among other things, on the sort of discussions Janet Yellen is having in China today. Then I'm going to talk about warming. I'm going to make a fairly bold prediction, which is that we will pass 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels in the early 2030s, and we're not going to stop a continuing rise. And we have to plan on that, which means whatever you think will happen to mitigation in the long term, the real game for many emerging and developing countries and also high-income countries for the next 2 decades will be adaptation. And I think we really have to get that in our minds. Yes, it's defeatism, but it's also realism. It is obvious, while adding to this, I'd like to put this chart in. This is about the shares in global emissions of carbon dioxide over the last century. Everybody knows that back in the 100 years ago, basically all of them came from developed countries, which are the dark blue, the light yellow, and the light blue. So you can see that those emission shares have collapsed. By 2018, much the same now, they were about 35% of total emissions. And as I like to tell my friends in the EU and the British themselves, what we do about climate emissions mitigation is now basically irrelevant. It just doesn't matter. What does matter is what happens here, in China, and the rest of the developing world, and it is, of course, where the biggest challenges arise in terms of financing and managing to sustain growth while doing the transition. And on this, I'm afraid I'm pretty damn pessimistic, but I hope I'm wrong. Now, so climate gets worse. And the final thing I wanted to talk about is the creation of a transformed world technologically, because we are in the process of a profound change, ongoing change of information and communications technology. So this chart shows the share of the population using the world, using the internet. And I updated this one very recently. It's the latest that I found online. The world share of population using the internet is now 60%. Many of you may know this, but basically that's getting towards every adult. And in developed countries, but also East Asia and the Pacific, it's saturation. And in South Asia will be there, which is basically will be there within 10 years, for sure. So everybody in the world is connected to one of these damn machines, and that's transformative. It's completely transformative. It's a point I first started making 25 years ago in presentations, and we haven't, I think, begun to grasp what this means. Of course, the driving force, I'm afraid this chart is far too beautiful and detailed for you all to read, but the basic point is Moore's law. And I did some research on Moore's law. Gordon Moore's article on the Moore's law must be the single most important article written in the last 100 years, and certainly the most brilliant. And I remember hearing about it in 1970 when I was at the World Bank and we didn't even have an electric calculator. And I thought, this is crazy. But he was right. He said, with unit costs falling as the number of components per circuit rises, by 1975, economics may dictate squeezing as many as 65,000 components, transistors that is, on a single chip. Today it is 11.8 billion. And there's lots of debate out there whether they're getting to the natural limits, but there are other technologies. Quantum computing is the most exciting in this area. And of course, there's probably enough processing power in our system already to do whatever they are able to do in artificial intelligence. And I suspect they're going to do a lot. So this is my summary of the big things that are going on. And one has to think about the implications of these and how they interact. Then I'm going to talk about the shocks, and they're basically these three: the pandemic, the war and energy, and the inflationary process we're living with now. I'd love to talk about more, but I'm already going to run over a little. So let me talk about the pandemic. Pandemics are part of human history. What is really interesting to me, and I wrote some pieces at the time, is that on almost every dimension you can imagine, COVID was a relatively mild pandemic in terms of fatalities and so forth. But it proved immensely disruptive. My friend Surjit has written lots of stuff about that. And my view is it became so disruptive because it could be. What was interesting about the pandemic is not the pandemic, but how societies responded. And why could it be? Because we had the sorts of economies and the sorts of institutions, particularly in the high-income countries, that will allow us to close our economies down. And nobody ever thought of doing that. Well, of course, there's been quarantine before, and quarantine's been around forever. But the idea you would actually close down the economies for months, indefinitely, essentially, in order to control the disease is something that never crossed anybody's mind before. And one of the most interesting, this is why we learn so much from this sort of experience, is that I looked in the process at some wonderful forecasts done by the Congressional Budget Bureau and the EU's Economic Forecasting Division of what would happen if we had something like the Spanish flu again, which is much worse than COVID, and they seriously underestimated the economic consequences for the reasons I suggested. I think this is a fascinating lesson. Will we do this again? I don't know. Now, one of the consequences of this is shown here, which is we developed absolutely staggeringly large fiscal deficits to support our economies, and all that went into people's pockets, unspent, of course, initially, because there was nothing to spend it on. And in addition, which is my next chart, I've just got one, I could have zillions of charts, but I think this is so startling. This is the Fed. This is the Fed's most watched money supply as data, which is M2. It goes back to 1960. I continue to be one of those hoary old people who thinks money data tells you something useful, which helped me a great deal in forecasting in an article I wrote in May 2020 that there will be serious inflation after this event. And nobody believed me and the few other nutcases who thought like me, including every single major international organization. Won't go into that. But anyway, what is interesting is this chart has two things to tell us. After the financial crisis, the money supply growth was kept very much in line with pre-crisis figures because of the red stuff you can see, which is base money expansion, or QE. They did what Milton Friedman said they should do, which you'll all remember that, which is to keep base money expanding, helicopter drops if you want, not quite, in order to offset the collapse of private credit growth. In the COVID, they did no such thing. They had a massive private credit growth supported by the central banks and the governments, and a massive M2 growth, and this is the largest expansion of M2 by a very substantial margin since 1960. In addition, of course, after the COVID, we've had some price shocks. This shows the real price of oil, goes back to 72. There was a very big rise in the real price of oil, but note it was by no means significant compared to what happened in the early 2000s, which generated no serious inflation at all. And though we've had a very large expansion in gas prices, and I'm focusing on the developed country experience in this, in gas prices, which are shown here, Dutch LNG and Asian LNG, all that is over. So these price shocks are either small or over, and we still have this. In other words, those, in my not very humble view, of course, those people who argue this is essentially about supply shocks are just obviously wrong. It's the interaction of excess demand with some modest supply shocks from the developed country point of view, and massive excess demand. And that's shown in labor markets. I can't go into all of this, and my views on this remain very controversial, but I think you can see pretty clearly these are core inflation rates, and they are not just the energy and food, which are the other elements, the things that are stripped out. We have a serious core inflation problem, which is what I argued in the Cortilia conference here a year ago. Now, this, of course, has led to central banks tightening, so we have moved into a radically different monetary environment, and as Helene's wonderful presentation told you yesterday, that's going to cause trouble, particularly if it lasts a long time. And in my view, it's going to last quite a while. And Mr. Powell has just said it's going to get worse. So that's a pretty big part of our environment. High inflation, high interest rates, tightening monetary policy, and that's an important part of the shock environment. Now, that then leads me to the next thing, which is fragilities, close to the end of this. And the fragilities I'm going to talk about are debt, states, politics, and international institutions. These are the things that are going to cause us problems, given the shifts and the shocks I have talked about. So let me start with the debt story. This is not, I'm not going to make a simple, a complex analysis. This is just a pretty simple point. If you have an awful lot of debt about, and there's a massive rise, and by the way, in nominal and real interest rates, you're likely to have problems somewhere. And we've seen some of it already, and I don't think it's... So this looks at sovereign debt over GDP of emerging market economies in aggregate and of developed countries in aggregate. And the simple point is that by 2021, these were at historic peaks. And we've succeeded in getting to World War II levels without having a major war, which is quite extraordinary. Something like this in peacetime in developed countries is completely unprecedented. The second thing, this is the global picture for debt. So this is gross debt over world GDP. There's a limit to how complicated the charts are. This is decomposed into the government at the top, financial corporates, non-financial corporates below them, and then households. These are for the entire world. And you can see the most important point you should draw from this is the gross stock of debt, and I understand all the problems with that, but I think it's a good fragility measure, is now significantly higher in the world relative to world GDP than it was at the time of the global financial crisis. And the particular expansion here has been predominantly in government debt and non-financial corporate debt. And that is shown here. You can see the components. The greens are households, that's roughly stable. Financial corporates have really, particularly in the West, not increased dramatically their leverage since, in fact, they've shrunk it since the global financial crisis. But what is blown up is non-financial corporates, which have had a fantastic leverage, holiday, fun with the zero rates, and government debt, as you say. So debt is a really big leverage problem. And of course, its fundamentals, the impact of debt on the system will depend on real interest rates. These are derived from 10-year index-linked bonds going back to 85 for the UK and US. You can see that real interest rates are still actually fairly modest, but they have risen dramatically since the central bank started to tighten, and one of the big issues is where they will now go. The second thing I want to talk about, it seems to me incredibly important, is what's going on in states. And there's a profound ideological shift going on. That's the point, which is also political. Reagan famously, I'm from the government, and I'm here to help. And I'm afraid to tell you, or at least those of you who really believe that we should have stuck with the old era, that era is now over. And if you want to understand that, I suggest you look very carefully at what Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump agree on. They agree on this. They have very different views about what you use the state for. But nonetheless, government spending and debts have reached very high levels in high-income countries. And aging is going to make this worse, especially in Europe and Japan. States are also becoming increasingly interventionist and protectionist. I hope you've all read Jake Sullivan's speech on the future of US economic policy. There's lots of talk of de-risking, friendshoring, and a foreign policy for the middle class. So the old globalization ideology, free market ideology, is clearly dead. Then there's politics. Politics have become increasingly populist and divisive, more or less everywhere. We're seeing a rise in autocracy. I've just written a book on that. We have a major war, moved into a world in which politics and geopolitics are dominant, as has often been the case before. And finally, we've got international institutions. A divided world with more active national governments erodes international cooperation. There is no longer a natural hegemon for the reasons I've suggested. China has, of course, been creating its own institutions of development assistance and cooperation. Cooperation on core challenges is proving difficult, and that's an understatement. Institutions are eroding, notably the World Trade Organization, but it's not like the Cold War because China and the US are both deeply inside the system. This creates completely new challenges, and that's the last of our fragilities. So with this, I'm not wildly over about 5 minutes, scenarios. What might happen with all this over the next 5 to 10 years? So I don't know, so I'm going to give you some scenarios. So one nice possibility is we're not going to have any more shocks, no more wars, no more pandemics. Inflation will quietly subside. People will decide that all this confrontation is not a good idea. They will reach a few agreements at the margin on what are strategic issues, and great power relations stabilize. The world is still more divided and fractious than before 2008, but it's manageable. It's stabilized. And that would mean, in addition, that sort of business back to more, inflation falls, interest rates decline, globalization stabilizes, AI generates a new upsurge in growth. But again, the world economy will remain more divided and fractious than before 2008. So this is the most benign scenario I can think of, and I think it's definitely very significant possibility, maybe even 50%. But a lot has to go right for that to happen. The second world I can imagine is a deeply divided world. A democratic Western bloc, democratic in quote marks, confronts a China-Russia bloc. This shapes economics, with China and US substantially decoupling, countries forced to choose between them, trade and capital flows across the blocs at least substantially weaken. That's clearly non-zero too. And that you can clearly imagine events that would generate that outcome. If, for example, I'm not predicting, but it's not a non-zero chance, Mr. Putin thinks he's going to lose in Ukraine and uses a nuclear weapon, the world is going to change very, very quickly, in my view. The third possibility, which I don't like to think about, is that populism, nationalism, or protectionism actually transform and divide the West. And particularly relations between the US and EU are profoundly disrupted. And I think if Trump becomes re-elected, that is really quite a likely probability. It'll be a very different presidency, and the Europeans don't like to think about it. But that would change the world in really profound way. The fourth possibility is we just get many more shocks. Financial shocks, we could have another global financial crisis, for the trade wars, pandemics, real climate disasters generating mass migration and more conflict. And the cooperative global order basically disappears. And the worst of all is we get war between great powers, which would change everything. And it seems to me any one of these scenarios is possible, though I hope desperately that the last three are at least unlikely. But one should think about them. And then finally, what does all this mean for India? Well, the first point I would make is that the global environment has changed fundamentally. It is irretrievably more dangerous and chaotic, in my view, than it was prior to 2007. We are in a different world, and we shouldn't believe that we're likely to go back to anything like that. That clearly creates huge risks. But assuming we don't get any of the shattering disasters that I mentioned, it also offers India some spectacular opportunities. India has the potential, because it's a power in the middle which doesn't deeply threaten either side, it can form useful and productive economic relations with all sides, at least some economic relations. It could, if it tried hard, partially or perhaps substantially replace China as a competitive global supplier of goods and services. I think there's a real opportunity in a China plus one, or maybe not even a China, but that I think we're a long way from. It could, in the result, become a magnet for foreign investment, but it will, I think, at the same time be tempted by the sight of all those aggressive industrial policies in the rest of the world. And it will say to itself, well, if it's good for the Americans, it must be good for us. Very bad view. And maybe even a thought, well, this is such a dangerous world, maybe we should go back to self-sufficiency. I would suggest it must be very careful about these temptations. But I would stress what I've always stressed in such discussions: the obstacles to the necessary progress in this country lie, as always, in domestic institutions, policies and politics, on the assumption that the world doesn't actually blow itself up. Thank you for listening.
Well, that was vintage Martin Wolf. Fantastic. I'm sort of glad that I'm actually chairing this session and I don't have to comment on it. It is such a compelling presentation that even for our two panelists who can do all the heavy lifting, this is going to be a challenge. But let us see. Montek, we start with you and then we come to you, Anant. Say 8 to 10 minutes.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Arvind. Well, first of all, let me say, Martin, that was really fantastic. I mean, quite up to the standards that we've come to expect from you. It's what I call a very, very rich presentation. And it kind of almost makes it impossible to make comments on it. I mean, that it's such a wide range that he's covered, that the best thing one can do is to apologize for not conceding one's time to Martin so he could have carried on a little longer. But since I've been asked to make comments, just make one or two. I'm not actually going to comment on the multiple scenarios. Actually, it does bear a lot of thinking. And clearly, I'm assuming that whoever, in this situation, whoever is responsible for running a government or making policy must be thinking of plan B, plan C, plan D to respond to each of the different scenarios. I don't envy anyone that job. The thing that I'm tempted to comment on is what Martin said at the very end, which is that, you know, what is it? Does it offer opportunities for India? I mean, it's clear that on some scenarios, the situation could well be so bad that whatever little opportunities it offers will be swamped by the overall negative effect. But somewhere between the gradual return to normalcy, or maybe even a little bit worse than that, there is an opportunity in the sense that India would be a large country in a messed up world in which there's an overall, if you like, shrinkage of globalization or slowbalisation, but can India sort of play a larger role? Now, actually, many people commenting on the situation have said that this is an opportunity. But I think Martin has rightly pointed out that we need to be very clear if we want to benefit from this opportunity, do we simply sit back and wait for the opportunities to arrive? Or do we recognize this is ultimately a competitive process? And although we have some advantages, being large and also moving compared to the earlier days, moving a lot better, but it's not the case that we don't have obstacles that would prevent us from actually fully utilizing these opportunities. And that, to my mind, is the critical policy decision and indeed policy debate that India has to go through. I mean, my own view on this, I've expressed it many times, is quite clear that while the rest of the world is moving away from openness, we were so far from openness that we don't have to do the same thing. As a matter of fact, we need to continue a little more openness so we can be a little less embarrassed about why we are not open, and people will understand. But, you know, we have to be more open than we were. What he calls being driven into self-reliance would be a mistake. It's certainly true that what the Americans have now done, which is to sort of follow a strategy of hugely subsidizing certain industries, this will actually be a temptation even here. I was very struck by Poonam saying yesterday that when she went to the Commerce Ministry and sort of said that, look, India has great prospects for the services exports, that she was asked, do you think we can have a PLI on service exports? So, you know, these mechanical reactions will happen. And I think we need that to be debated early, and we need enough people making it clear what they think so the government can hear these points of view. But on the whole, that's the only sensible thing for us to be planning for. I mean, there's not much point planning for a world that has collapsed. I mean, if it really has collapsed, it'll be terrible, and we have to do the best we can. But we can't plan for that. We have to plan for a situation where it won't be what it was like before, but the critical decisions we have to take are, what are we going to do to make India a better place to do business in? And you know, I think that our trade restrictions are too high and need to be lowered. I mean, since the multilateral trading framework is pretty much moribund, and the only way you can liberalize trade is now having some FTAs, etc., which traditionally have not been looked upon with favor in India. But I think it's important to sort of set ourselves the target that, look, if the only liberalization around the world is going to take place through liberalization in blocks, are we going to stay out of all these blocks, or are we going to join some? Now, quite honestly, these do pose some difficult issues, because, for example, when the RCEP decision was around the corner, and many people thought that, you know, we were actually going to join RCEP. Some people felt that may not be the right thing to do, but since the signals that had been given were very much that India is going to join, it was a bit of a surprise that at the last minute we opted out. Now, when I talk to people, the only argument I get is that, no, we can't join a free trade area that has China in it. And that's an open question. I mean, you know, are we expecting to become competitive with everyone except China? Or it's not very clear to me that, you know, we can't actually join just because China is there. You can negotiate terms which would give you a little more time to adjust. But, you know, if the idea is not to expose yourself, offer zero tariff treatment to China, then actually the alternative is to join the CPTT, which is a much, much tougher agreement where you have to align a lot of other policies. And actually, I don't find that this is being adequately discussed at all. I mean, if we take the view, our traditional view has always been, Commerce Ministry's traditional view has always been that behind the border adjustment of standards is actually outside the realm of trade theory, and therefore it's anathema. Now, if that's really the case, we can't join any FTA at all. We will find, particularly with the climate change threats, that, you know, accepting certain environmental standards is going to be unavoidable. And the EU is going to thrust them down our throats anyway by the CBAM, which becomes operative by 2026. So this is a very small part of Martin's very rich presentation about what all this means for the world. And I don't feel competent. I certainly can't add to that. So all I would say is look over the presentation, think about it, and ask him some tough questions. The only thing I want to focus on is somewhere in his presentation is the suggestion that if India did the right things, India could actually benefit. So the question is, what are those right things? Is it the case that we are following optimal policies anyway, and the only thing we have to do is continue to maintain macro stability? Or is it the case, which is going to be difficult enough, by the way, given Poonam's paper and Barry's paper yesterday, which shows what's going on with our debt ratios, which is going to get worse because of climate change and all the investment needed. I think we do have to recognize that there are, in the areas of trade integration, a whole lot of difficult decisions. And it's important for the public to be made aware of them and for ground to be prepared. that if that's the way we want to go, there's a lot of preparing the ground that will be necessary. Well, with those words, thank you very much for inviting me to comment, and thanks, Martin, for a very, very exciting presentation.
Thank you, Montek. Anantha?
Thank you, Professor Panagariya. And I joined Mr. Ahluwalia in congratulating Martin for a tour de force kind of presentation. And I agree with him that it will be difficult to do justice to every single item that he covered in his comprehensive presentation. So I'll start with I'll narrow it down to the eastward shift, which he talked about, because India is part of that eastward shift, so that I can use that as a segue to comment on India and Indian prospects as part of that eastward shift. First of all, this eastward shift is not preordained. It's not guaranteed. It is not that we just simply have to show up and it is going to happen. But if you look at long-term theories, cycle theories, they do suggest that the shift is going to will happen, because we have had 200 plus years of steady dominance of the Western world based on the Industrial Revolution, etc. And maybe it has run its course, and there is a possibility of this reversing in the course of this century, but certainly it has to be earned. And second, it may be slower in coming than we think. And it may also be punctuated by a very long period of vacuum, or you might call it multipolarity, including possibly clash of civilizations before this eastward shift happens, if at all it does. But while it may be difficult to go into all these risk factors, what I can say is that one of the biggest, more tangible risk is this climate risk, along with it the energy security or the energy transition risk that could be more material and relatively near to medium term. Certainly, we all agree that there has been global warming in the last 30 years. But we also know that the half-life of carbon is about 120 years. So, for example, if we were to put out 100 tons of carbon, and at least 1 kilogram of that would remain in the atmosphere after 1,680 years. So, in that sense, the challenge before many of the Asian countries, which includes India, is how do we therefore address and prepare ourselves for the impact of carbon that's already out there in the atmosphere, not just carbon, but greenhouse gases, while we continue to focus on reducing or containing our share of emissions going forward. Which of these two is the most important priority? The narrative that comes from the developed world is that global challenges such as pandemic and climate are the same as development challenges. I consider this a clever argument, maybe even a seductive argument, but not necessarily true. Because countries like India will have to put more efforts on adaptation and resilience rather than mitigation in terms of sequencing of its priorities, because these countries, wherein I include India, and there are many other countries in South Asia as well as in East Asia, we have to address our development challenges so that we can actually contribute to addressing the global challenges. And that is the biggest threat that we face today from the external world, because this entire narrative on energy transition and climate change is also, whether intended or not, is a challenge for convergence, for economic convergence. And that we need to face. And that is both a geopolitical and a geo-economic challenge. Because just before coming here, I read an article in Bloomberg that Norway, which has made the greatest progress in reducing its dependence on fossil fuels, still has a huge deal of dependence on them. And Norway had the fiscal resources to be able to spend on this transition, whereas countries like ours and several other developing countries, even more precariously placed than India on the fiscal aspect will find it difficult to generate the resources to be able to make this transition. And those resources have to come from economic growth, whether it is for the public sector or the private sector. Therefore, putting primacy on economic growth is important so that we can address not only our climate challenges, but also contribute to addressing the climate challenges for the rest of the world. But how are we going to manage that in the presence of the current narrative is going to be a very important challenge for us. And this, along with this growth challenge, is the issue of debt. I was not able to attend the presentation or read the paper by Barry and Poonam, which I will. Today's developed countries were able to accumulate debt, pay them down, again accumulate debt. They could do all of that because growth was still, relatively speaking, a low-hanging fruit. But going forward, in the presence of this energy security and energy transition risk, whether growth will be able to help us accumulate debt and pay them down as easily as other countries did when they were in the growth phase is a big question mark for countries like India and other developing countries as well. And that naturally places constraints on the maximum speed limit for growth rates for countries like India when we try to match, for example, China's growth rates when we aspire for them. Even in the case of China, if you could look at it, between 1979 and 2007, they had a period of very strong growth, 9% real GDP terms, in real GDP terms. But subsequently, post-2008, slowly but steadily, the quality of growth came down, and much of it was due to debt accumulation. So whether we have that ability to enhance our debt ratios and grow is a question mark. Then, of course, while we look at some of the numbers, we can see that India's public debt ratio was about 81% in 2005, is now about 84% of GDP. In fact, India is one of the very few countries, other than Indonesia and Germany, that have seen their debt ratios barely move in the last 15 to 17 years, which includes two major crises, the pandemic and the global financial crisis of 2008. And secondly, we know that we do have the capacity for nominal GDP growth of around 10%, and I'm not being extremely ambitious here, for the next 7 to 10 years at the minimum. And if our cost of capital does indeed stay at around 7% as it is today, then it is possible that this growth cost of capital dynamic for the public sector will help us bring down the debt ratios. But I'm also aware that the interest payments as a percentage of tax revenues of the government is probably the highest among G20 countries, which sort of attests to the fact that historically our cost of capital has been much higher, and that in turn was because of the kind of inflation rates that we have had to endure in the past several decades. So that brings me to the immediate near to medium term prospects for India, which is that yes, we spend the second decade improving balance sheets, banking, non-banking, and the non-financial corporate sector, which is what basically held our growth back to some extent compared to the promise that we all felt in the first decade. But now that balance sheet repair process is largely complete. And secondly, if you look at the inflation overshoot last year in India, compared to other countries in the world, our target range was 2 to 6%, and our peak inflation rate was 7.8%. And therefore, the Reserve Bank of India was able to raise interest rates only by 250 basis points and stop there compared to other countries which still have to keep on raising interest rates. And Martin showed the chart on core inflation that is sticky, etc. And I'm hypothesizing here that India may have done something different than it had in the past in terms of addressing its supply side constraints in the last several years compared to the past, when we always ended up with overheating issues after 3 to 5 years of good growth. Non-performing assets, rising trade deficit, overvalued exchange rate, current account, etc., and high inflation, etc., etc., which made us therefore enter into a period of higher interest rates, fiscal consolidation, and therefore lower growth, currency depreciation, lower growth, etc. It is quite possible that we may have done something to improve our supply capacity in the last several years, and the proof of the pudding will be felt in the coming 7 to 8 years if we are able to sustain a growth rate of at least 6.5% per annum without overheating. But I do feel that the potential for that seems to me to be pretty good. The third reason for my relative constructive optimism for the near term or the near to medium term is, of course, these advancements in the digital infrastructure space, which of course have advanced the cause of financial inclusion, formalization, and market access. But still, in spite of this, I would peg the potential at 6.5%, and coincidentally, yesterday Dr. Vivek Debra also has given some interview where he also puts that number at 6.5, simply because we do believe that the export growth prospects that we all enjoyed in the first decade are not going to be available for the remainder of this decade or even longer, given the state of the global economy and the global growth. So what are the risk factors? As I mentioned already, the biggest risk factor for India is this debate between, or the challenge between, energy security, which we need, and energy transition, which is partly imposed by the state of the carbon budget that we have, which obviously has been overused by other countries in the past. The second challenge for us is human resources, human endowment, and the quality of our educational attainments, which we all know, whether you read the ASER report or other reports, etc. So the capability of our human resources to be able to adapt to this growth challenges we have, and the kind of education system that we have at the secondary, at the primary, and in the higher education levels, whether in terms of communication, whether in terms of problem articulation, and being able to bring in multiple perspectives, etc., that I think is going to be the big issue. When bulk of the routine tasks can be handled by technology, and even more so by AI, what is the differentiation that our youngsters can bring to the table? The multiple perspectives. So are we preparing our youngsters for that? That is what will make the difference between demographic dividend and demographic deadweight. And the third challenge we face is the absence of a sense and unity of purpose in the country. And the fourth, which people like Devesh Kapoor have addressed over the years and continue to do so, is state capacity and capability at all levels, including strategic clarity. These are the challenges that we face, and I'll stop my initial remarks here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anand. Thank you. Okay, Martin, I'll make a few comments very quickly, pointed ones. One comment is on the shifts that you talked about, Martin, where you talked about high-income countries plus China, meaning, being 28%. But remember that this is 2050 that you are mentioning. By that time, probably India will be a high-income country, and Southeast Asia, some countries in Latin America as well. So 2050, actually, if we do not get into the crises kind of territory, looks quite good, very good actually from the global perspective. The poverty will be much reduced, prosperity would be much more widespread than perhaps your slide showed. Here we had some pessimism on export opportunities for India. Personally, I think that in spite of all the talk of backlash to free trade and de-globalisation, slowbalisation, the retaliation of tariffs or the embargoes, etc., the fact of the matter remains that exporters are a very determined lot. Pre-COVID peak, which was in 2018 for merchandise exports, was about 19 trillion. By 2022, you are already up to 25 trillion. Your services trade peak was 6 trillion. You are already in 2022 to 7 trillion. So you got together $32 trillion export market. India's problem really is not the opportunities in the global economy. India's problem is how to get a larger slice of a very large market that exists out there. We are less than 2% on merchandise trade. Services, we are between 3 and 4. But China on merchandise is about 12%. I think we ought to do better. And so this has to do really what Montek said, a few things about openness, etc. The answers are inside the country, not outside the country. My last point, I want to pick up on what Anantha said, Martin, on the mitigation. If I heard you correctly, in passing you said that, well, stock certainly came from the United States, Europe, etc. But now when it comes to the future mitigation, the real action is elsewhere. And that elsewhere, of course, means China, India, all the developing countries. If I understood you correctly, if that is what was said, even if factually that is correct, you cannot put the burden of this on these countries. Ultimately, then, there ought to be some sort of compensation coming from the past polluters. I mean, the space that is occupied in the, I mean, the carbon space that is occupied by the richer countries is disproportionately large. And even if the future has to be through mitigation by the other countries, then the cost has to be proportionally shared. I see no kind of offer. So it's a good ploy in a way by the Western countries to say that, well, you know, we are mitigating, but this is just not going to be enough. So you got to do a lot more. But well, I think, you know, there ought to be some sort of cost sharing. So those are my thoughts. We come back to you for response.
Okay, I have no comments on what the two discussants said. It all seemed very sensible. I'm not going to comment on, because I think I can leave Montek to fight this out, or anyone else, on the priorities given by Anantha, and which seem to me pretty sensible. And I'm not going to comment on the optimism about India, but I will comment on the couple of points you made, because they're directed to me, and one overlaps. So first of all, you're right, the high-income countries in those charts are defined as those now. I think there's obviously going to be a question of what the category of high-income countries is going to look like 30 years from now, and how much real GDP in these countries will grow, and therefore how far it will be a moving target. And that's a very interesting question, which I carefully avoided. But I assume there will be some growth. So I am reasonably confident, looking at the world, that there will be no important Latin American country that will be in the high-income status by 2050. I think it will be very difficult to think of one in Africa. I may be missing one, but it doesn't look likely. And I hope you're right about India. It's a fairly optimistic view of what's going to happen, but I hope you're right. But I don't think the group will change quite as much as you think. If you look at the major Latin America, I've done quite a lot of work on this, their relative GDP per head, let's take Brazil versus America. The relative GDP per head of Brazil, or Mexico actually, relative to America, is today exactly the same as it was 40 years ago. There's been no relative rise at all. There are a number of emerging countries which have experienced large relative rises, and far and away the most important are, of course, China and India over that period. And this underlies the eastward shift. Basically, all the successful countries have been in South and East Asia, which is a fascinating reality. The second point, I agree completely that India is small enough that displacement is a perfectly viable strategy for a long time. I mean, just displacing a significant proportion of Chinese exports, if possible, while China, of course, upgrades at the same time, would give India a spectacular opportunities in manufacturing, and not insignificant one in services. So as I argued, and as Montek argued, the dominant question is the competitiveness of India as a base, and I think between you, you commented on the determinants of that, which I think are overwhelmingly domestic. The really big issue that came up, and this is climate justice, as you were. I think I need to clarify what I said. I said so much, no doubt some of it was unclear. My comment was definitively not a moral one, though we can go into that. It was a statement of what I think is going to happen. It seems to me that the mitigation efforts of the developed countries, given that they only generate about a third of the emissions now, will not be sufficient on their own if there are not dramatic mitigation efforts in the emerging and developing world to stop total emissions from rising, and certainly not falling appreciably. And therefore my prediction is that we will not successfully mitigate the climate challenge over at least the next 2 decades. This being so, governments have to, whatever they want to do, or indeed whatever their own policies on mitigation are, they have to plan for adaptation. And I think that is consistent, as I understood it, with what Anantha said. And that's the point I was making. And making that statement, by the way, in Europe would be regarded as pretty close to total treason, because the idea that this is not going to happen is not one that can be discussed. Now then, that's crucial. There are 2 points that emerge from that from a moral point of view. Well, we are not, there isn't going to be enough negative emissions anywhere to offset the current and almost certain future emissions from the emerging and developing countries if they don't mitigate like mad too. That's just a matter of the climate future, because we don't yet know, as far as I can see, and I've looked into this quite carefully, how to remove carbon at scale. That might happen, but it's where we are now. Of course, we could do other exciting things, geoengineering, but I think we probably shouldn't plan for those. So that means the emerging and developing countries, if we want to mitigate it, will have to play a very large role in the energy transition. That's just a matter of logic. Now, what you're saying is, if you are asking us to bear a huge burden and you're not prepared to pay for it, and we don't regard it as sufficiently in our interest to do this, given that we also have the overwhelming priority of development, which may be more important than managing climate, and you don't pay us to compensate us, it's just not going to happen, and it shouldn't. Well, that's a matter for you to decide. What I can say is that, this is not a moral statement, it's a statement of fact, that the chances that compensation on the relevant scale will come from the high-income countries to offset the calculus I've just put forward, as I understand it, it is yours, the chances are basically 0, and that just confirms the point I made, that we are not going to mitigate the climate problem at a collective level. And one of the reasons we're not going to do it is it's far too unpleasant. And the other reason is we're going to be poking our fingers at one another for whatever good reasons and saying it's your fault anyway. Now, so that's what's going to happen as a prediction. Now, there is one qualifier to that, which I think is very important. I discussed this with Hélène, and I've written about this. It is possible, though I'm profoundly unconvinced it is true, that climate mitigation technologies will turn out to be so efficient that they are actually the dominant technologies, in which case the problem to some degree vanishes, because you will find that going for renewables will actually be the most efficient path. It will also have some quite nice local pollution consequences, which you would probably like. And therefore, maybe the problem will disappear because we're incredibly lucky. We're going to find technologies which, in aggregate, can put us on a different energy path without paying a very large price. At the moment, I would say, from what I have read, I'm skeptical about that. But the chances no longer seem to me zero, or even close to zero, in which case humanity may be luckier than it deserves. And a lot of my friends who work on this much more intensely than me, like in Britain, Nick Stern and Adair Turner, would suggest what I've said now there is itself much too pessimistic. So all I'm trying to draw out is the implications of where we are. On the point of justice, I do not disagree with you, but if we argue about justice, of course, we just can agree that my prediction about what's going to happen will be correct.
We'll leave that. Would you like to say first, Ed, Montek?
Let's have the...
No, then of course I open, but okay. So, all right. Barry.
I will attempt to force Martin to address the question that he so studiously avoided. Of the trends or shifts you described, the one you omitted was productivity growth. We know that the majority of economic growth is productivity growth. We know that it has collapsed in the last 15 years, most spectacularly in your country, but globally. The World Bank is pessimistic about the prospects for global growth going out a decade or something like that. All the problems you described become easier to solve if we have faster productivity growth, and they become impossible to solve if we have slower productivity growth. So isn't that what it boils down to?
Well,
Martin.
do you want me to leave? Yeah, of course. Absolute apologies.
Poonam.
Thank you, Martin and everybody else. Two sets of questions, really. On climate, my view is if there is a will, there is a way to compensate. There's so many ways that the global south can be compensated. One is migration, which is a win-win for everyone, and still the advanced economies are not open to have more people from the global south. So in India's case, for example, the FTA with the UK is stuck exactly at this point. So even if the advanced countries do not want to pay in cash, the least they can do is transfer technology and take more people. So there are ways that can be found. The second thing is on inflation. It seems that inflation is coming down at a very slow rate, and it's likely that it will not come down to the pre-COVID levels anytime soon, which means that it will likely stay above the inflation targeting rates that many countries have. What does it mean for the longevity of inflation targeting? Obituaries have been written before, but the framework has survived. So do you think it will survive again this time? If not, what will replace it? Thank you.
Okay. Let me just put 4 names: Helen, Suman, Devesh, Rajeshwari.
So I have 2 quick questions. So one is for Martin and the other one is probably broader. So the first one is, Martin, you mentioned the effect of climate, that we are going to go for above 1.5, and likely it will create massive migration flows. And obviously this is a huge, question mark for Africa and Europe. And so how should we think about that? Is there anything that we should be doing to prepare for this, given the pressure we know about, what migration does to our democracy, let alone when migrations are being instrumented in various ways by some politicians and foreign powers? So that's the first question for Martin. And then a quick remark and question maybe for everyone on the link between public finance and climate. Are we making a little bit the same mistake as we did for COVID? COVID, if we had paid for vaccination, global vaccination, we would most likely have had in net present value huge positive return for the fiscal accounts for any big economy. The US could have done it, Europe could have done it, simply because the economic costs were so large that we could have internalized the positive effect on economic activity via tax revenues, etc., and in net present value terms, a small investment would have delivered a much better sustainability for our fiscal path. And so climate is a bit harder to conceive, but it's conceivable that given the size for large economies, we can internalize enough of the benefits for having investment being in net present value term absolutely positive for the fiscal balances. So that's a little bit the principle of dynamic scoring, and maybe we should think about that a bit more in terms of a public finance framework.
Suman?
Yeah, this is a little bit of a distraction, but it takes off from Martin's last slide about India. It's a question to you, Arvind, to Praveen, and maybe to Montek. I'm very confused by what is the right metric for calling India a closed economy and calling the US an open economy. So amongst practitioners of the trade, is this a question of tariff peaks? Is this only about merchandise trade? Is about barriers to investment? Because we don't actually know, what the reforms are unless there's some precision to this blanket kind of accusation that India is a closed economy and therefore is uncompetitive.
Okay, Devesh?
This is like for Martin. Richard Haas, who headed the Council of Foreign Relations in the US, he just stepped down. And in his farewell sort of address, he said that all these years, the focus of the Council of Foreign Relations was on the challenges that the US faced from outside. But that now he was convinced that the biggest challenge that the US faces is internal. This sort of refers to your point on political polarization. My question to you is, do you think that is a similar challenge that India also faces, which is a growing political polarization?
Okay, Rajeshwari, and then we come to Martin.
So I have two questions for Martin. One is on inflation. There's an argument that because of the growing concentration in the corporate sector, there's been a very large increase in the pricing power, which is why core inflation is proving to be much more sticky and persistent despite monetary policy tightening happening at a very aggressive rate. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. And the second question is a bit more general. What we have seen over the last 20, 30 years is there was a point of time when emerging markets were the main vulnerability areas of crisis, and we had a whole spate of Latin American and East Asian and Turkey and whatever it is, currency crisis and financial crisis. But then from 2000 onwards, all the problems are emanating from the developed world. So be the global financial crisis, QE, taper tantrum, now the inflation. So what is your thought on that? There seems to be that the emerging world has become relatively more stable, but the developed world has become significantly more unstable because the shocks emanating there, and we are sort of on the receiving side of it. I had one question for Anand, which is, you said about the balance sheet clearing, and it is true that the banking sector, the non-banking, and the corporate balance sheets have become significantly healthier than before. And the government has given a very big capex push for 3 consecutive budgets. But why is it that we are still not seeing a very strong recovery in the private investment cycle? Because without that, and given that exports are not going to be taking us to a high sustained GDP growth rate in the foreseeable future, with all the China +1 strategy discussion, private investment is extremely critical. So what is it going to take? Because it seems like rightly poised right now, but still there is no evidence in the data that the capex cycle in the private sector is exhibiting a very strong turn. So I would love to get your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Martin, Anand has to leave. So if I may give 2 minutes to him before we come to you.
Supposed to end anyway.
So that's what he thought. That's what you thought too.
It's all my fault.
First, to Helen's point about conceptually, I agree with you that you could internalize some of the cost and the net present value would still be positive. I think I find merit in what you say, but it's the question of whether the costs are front-loaded and the benefits are back-loaded, and how much would the initial cost have an impact on economic growth, which in turn could affect the future beneficial flows that could occur, and what is the right division between public investment and private investment in this, and what will be the front loading of costs, what will be the impact it will have on the cost of capital, etc. Also, therefore, what I'm trying to say is the translation of your conceptual argument into reality is going to depend on a lot on empirical data. Now, as for your question, Rajeshwari, about the private sector, it is no longer, based on the data that we look at, it is no longer a plane that is at the takeoff stage. We believe it has taken off. So, and we presented the data both in the economic survey and just 2 days ago also in the annual economic review for FY23, which was uploaded in the DEA website. So if you look at, for example, the cash flow data of a consistent sample of about 3,023 companies, to be very precise. These cash flow data are updated only twice a year, so we only have data for the first half of FY23, and therefore the full year data will come a few months later. So if you look at the capex spending, it was 2.1 lakh crores or 2.1 trillion rupees in FY21 for these 3,000 plus companies. 2.7 trillion rupees in FY22. This is only for first 6 months of data. And in FY23, it was 3.3 trillion rupees. So there's a clear trend in the capex pickup. And also, if I look at a not so consistent sample of some 1,900 companies in FY23, barring 3 or 4 sectors, the remaining 18 or 19 sectors, the capex spending was up in the private sector by more than 20% compared to the previous year. So, and then if you look at the capacity utilization rates in several sectors, so we do believe that the capex cycle has indeed begun to take off even in the private sector. And therefore, in fact, from FY24 onwards, it's a question of how far the state can pull back and concentrate on other areas and let the private sector drive. So I don't believe that it is still something that is waiting to happen.
Thank you. Just to reinforce very quickly, I don't know why this fiction continues that private sector investment is not picking up. Just look up the simple data. 34, investment to GDP ratio has gone up from something like 28-29% to 34% in the last 2 years. Well, this is not public sector investment mostly, because together state and center account for 6%, at the most 7% of GDP as the public sector investment. So the remainder is private sector, and such a large increase that has happened is because of the private sector. But somehow, I must say that I keep saying this in my interviews to the media and everybody, this fiction continues. So anyway, we come back to Martin. Just want to say that I have no doubt that between Martin and Montek on the one hand and dinner on the other, you will prefer Martin and Montek. So with the permission of the two of them, I'd like to extend this session to about till 8 o'clock. Is that all right? Can we do it? No.
It's fine for me, but I think it's very cruel for the participants.
No.
You can say you all have the option of leaving and having dinner, and I will enjoy, as so often before, a very nice conversation with Montek.
So okay, that means we are staying. Okay, we'll wait. First, Martin has to. I have to give Martin the time to respond to.
I will
everything.
do my best, and I will apologize to everybody for not analyzing and responding to these questions purposely. I didn't discuss productivity growth. I have another framework for this sort of global discussion, which makes the prospects for growth much more central. But the reason I didn't discuss it here is it's too complicated. I don't think we really understand what's going on. And we don't really have any sensible view of what might happen. That's my view. Beyond the fact that we are in the middle of what looks like another quite big technological revolution, and in what is clearly a general purpose technology, artificial intelligence, and that may turn out to be really quite significant, both in generating productivity and being economically destabilizing. The time horizon we don't know, but the point I tend to make in the presentations
for the global stuff is it is reasonable to assume that the world economy will grow, even if the developed countries don't grow very strongly, because there's so much catch-up potential and people have shown the capacity. But it also is reasonable to assume, because of what productivity growth has been doing in the developed countries, and because one of the biggest opportunities of catch-up in world history has now been to a significant extent exploited, it is plausible that growth will be slower in this decade, even if things go reasonably well, than, say, in the first decade of this century. No more. But I think we should plan on the assumption of growth for the reasons I've given. Second, various climate questions and others from Poonam. If there is a will, there's a way. Yes, the question is there a will? And my view is fairly simple. For most people in the world who matter, climate change remains completely abstract. I mean, we talk about the things that already happened. You know, the weather's a bit hotter, yes. Some people are dying because it's a bit hotter. But there are some forest fires, mostly where nobody lives, except in California, and who really cares about Californians? And of course, there are lots and lots of people who say the world is ending, but it has no real traction, in my view, and that's why when Mr. Biden decided to do climate policy, he actually turned it into industrial policy, and I suspect most of it will fail. The migration, how do you do the bargain? Well, we should certainly transfer technology, but it ain't going to be done for free. The political economy of intellectual property in the developed countries is horrible, and as you must have realized when you look at what happened over vaccines, and which was the simplest thing on earth. And I'm afraid I've got a whole vast section in my recent book on the crisis of democratic capitalism, the prospect of allowing migration at the level which would deal with the migration pressures from countries like India or Sub-Saharan Africa, this relates to it, is zero. It's not even 0.1%. It would create a war. And I don't mean a small war, I mean a big war. And this is probably the single most frightening prospect to me that we're going to have, to take one example, the complete militarization of the Mediterranean. It terrifies me. And that's where we're going to go. So I wanted you to think about these things. These are not benign changes. This is end of the Roman Empire type terror. Now, I'm not approving or disapproving. I'm not going to go into more about the climate investment thing. I think in theory you're right. The question, I've been writing about climate pricing and internalization and all this for 20 years. We make no traction on that, and that's also related to Raghu Rajan's wonderful plan, which I strongly supported for climate transfers by charging countries which have above average emissions per head and benefiting those, and none of this is unfortunately going to happen. And the reason for that is, as a point I made already in my globalization book, and you know this very, very well, it's related to them, in the end, political legitimacy is defined by and operates at the national level. And that's true for all countries. And that's why managing our world is so impossible. So the logical thing to do is have a global government. Good luck with that as a plan. What is the right view of openness? Well, my view is fairly straightforward in that. You have to measure barriers. But measuring barriers is difficult. There are lots of problems with it, but that's what one did when one looked at trade policy when I was a child at the World Bank and did these sorts of measures. You can't measure it on ratios. Because they don't tell you, they are really difficult to interpret. Now, of course, you can do some simple variables which look at country size and development, and you can get something out of that, but I think you also have to look at policy. The US challenges are internal, of course, but they are related to, and above all, they are triggered by perceptions of externally generated problems. The first law of politics is if something is going wrong at home, which is essentially a distributional struggle, find foreigners to blame. That's just how we are. The most important reality of humanity, and without exception, is we are tribal. Then the questions on that runs through so much of the depressing reality of our world. Concentration in the corporate sector and inflation, I'm inclined to think that's a factor. It's something I discuss in my book. They got a colossal demand boost. They responded as you would expect them to do, and they're going to try and hold on to it. Workers, on the other hand, got a pretty massive real wage decline. I've discussed that in a recent column, and they want that back. And we've got very strong demand in most of our societies, despite the tightening of monetary policy, and I can't discuss why that's happened, but I would be happy to do so. And so we have an inflation problem. Then you get to the question, which is, I think it was yours, but I may remember, somebody asked, is what is the future of inflation targeting? Was that? Okay, so I was trying to put these together. And the answer is, I have two answers to that. One, I really don't know. Somebody said economists, was it Bibek who said, somebody said economists never say they don't know. I really don't know, but I am prepared to bet that the ECB will not give up inflation targeting, because if they do, they will blow up the euro. I may be wrong, but the Germans may have changed so much that they don't really care if inflation is 7% forever, but I wouldn't bet on it, and that's mortal. The US, I think, will stick with it. That's a much less certain bet, because the Fed is so highly dependent, because they will never agree on a set of institutional legal changes which would abolish the independence of the Fed. So the most likely country to give up is Britain, because that could happen overnight, because the government can do whatever it damn well please, because we live in an electoral dictatorship. I don't know whether that will happen, but I think the reasonable bet, in my view, but I'm very far from certain on this, is they are going to try to get back to 2%. That's not 100% certain, it's probably not even 80% certain, but I think it is the probability. And then there was this lovely question, is why the developed world is such a mess. Well, I have two answers to that, three answers. One, look at what's going to happen in China. They are struggling with a monstrous debt problem, which I think will turn out to be much more significant than they would admit and most of us realize. I may be wrong, but that's my guess. Second, people learn from experience, but they learn it slowly. So most emerging and developing countries, India didn't really have to learn this, but in Latin America, realized that actually serious financial and monetary instability is a very bad idea. There are always exceptions. Argentina has never learned. And you need to experience it. And obviously the financial crisis, because we managed it so well, quote unquote, it was managed pretty well. We didn't have a depression. It wasn't a big enough lesson. Now, there were lots of people who said we should have had a depression in 2008 and 9 because it would have taught us a proper lesson. My view then and now is that blowing up the world economy and your own society just to teach people a lesson is not good politics. But that's the main reason. And the final reason is, up to now, and it remains the case, we are continue to be able to borrow, even in Britain, amazingly, freely, with a current account deficit, which is very high, in our own currency. And as long as you can do that, nothing will persuade politicians to stop supporting financial riskiness. How will that all end? Well, that's why I had the debt discussion. I think there's a very high probability, in fact, I think it's close to 1, that over the next 10 years, maybe much sooner, we're going to have more really quite significant financial crises. Where they come from, how they evolve, I don't know, but it would be really sensible to expect that. And I think, as best I could, I hope I have responded to all these wonderful and difficult questions.
No, just, I mean, thank you for, I think Suman raised this question that, you know, why do we call India a closed economy? I don't think anyone calls India, by the way, a closed economy. What they say is we've become more closed than we were 4 or 5 years down the road, earlier. I think that's undoubtedly true. In fact, the chairman himself has written that the raising of tariffs was a bad idea. So there's the metric that's relevant is there. And that's the metric you need to look at. And I think we should go back to the original idea, which was that we bring our tariffs in line with those in East Asian countries. And if that requires some support for producers to make them more efficient, etc., that should be given the highest priority. That can still be done. Unfortunately, the chief economic advisor has left, so he doesn't have the benefit of this particular piece of advice, but others can convey it to him. I mean, you know.
You've just been mentioning this status. You want to add this? Montek said this. I mean, I have written enough on this, right? I mean, number of pieces I have written on it, and I'll add maybe, you know, if you read. But the implication of what Montek has said is we were, you know, close to where we needed to be, and we retreated. So the sense of where we were, do you think we were? I don't think Montek said that we were already close to where we needed to be. I don't think we had reached there. We had to do more, but 2007 it stopped. Up to 2007 there was liberalization, then it stopped. And then the big increase happened in 2018. If you read that budget, this was Finance Minister Arun Jaitley's budget, where he said that our long-standing policy has been to lower tariffs, but this year I am reversing it and raising several of the tariffs. So it's stated there actually. So the reversal is very much acknowledged in the budget document. So that's where it is. I had Govinda. Okay, all right. So Ratna. And if anybody still has burning desire to ask, okay, we have, and any? Oh, okay, so you will have the last question, and then we'll give it to Martin.
So fortunately, I don't have a question. I have a solution. A possible solution, if everybody bears to listen, hear me out. Okay, but it's on a serious note. So there is a solution which is so obvious in front of all of us, and that relates to removing women's economic, barriers to women's economic empowerment. Why do I say that? Let me say, the World Economic Forum estimates that on current policies, that's where the potential is, the gender disparity will close in 131 years at current policies. Before COVID, it was going to close at 100 years. So there's a huge potential there. There are studies that show, and this relates to Barry's point, and we know we've talked so much about the fact that the scope for trade as an engine of growth is not going to be there, at least in the near future. De-globalisation, supply chain disruptions. The IMF estimates that the trend growth is the lowest in the last 4 decades now, and that's what they predict for the next 10 years. There are studies that show that if female labor force participation, which in the global average is 50%, for men it's 80%, there's a huge potential for growth right there. And it's not just direct growth, just because there are more women working. At the margin, women are much more productive than men. I mean, it's obvious because you have a lot of educated women sitting at home. Number two, there are studies that show that, I've done myself, is that when there are more women leaders, more balanced boards, they take better decisions in terms of lower losses in banks, less non-performing loans. I'm going to send you the papers. There's nothing to laugh, really. And number three, when women have more access to finance, there's lower inequality in the country. And these are all global studies. So I think the future is with empowering women. That's all I want to say.
And women have lowest NPAs too. Yeah. Martin, there's quite a bit of uncertainty across international organization. Your thoughts in the way you've done the scenarios, what are the scenarios do you see facing multilateral financial institution? And Montek, a lot of our discussions, and I agree that India looking at itself and trying to strengthen its own institutions, but that kind of assumes that India is not able to make a market price. It seems that politically, India can influence a lot of the dialogues around institutional changes. Do you feel that India needs to be more, is there an opportunity for India to be more proactive in the way multilateral institutions are moving forward?
Okay. I'm not going to comment on what the consequences would be of absolutely identical male and female labour force participation, but obviously they'd be good. I was going through my head the differences within Europe between Scandinavia and Italy, and they support you largely, though Italy is still, of course, a high-income country, so there are other things going on. What I have thought, and I wrote a column about this, and which I think is incredibly important and relevant to this discussion, is that there is one aspect in which women are today seizing absolutely decisive power globally, and they are doing so by and large in the most patriarchal, relatively high-income countries. That is to say, they're out of the bondage of peasant society, and what they're doing is not having children. And there's a lot of evidence that fertility rates of women in high-income societies or relatively high-income societies, other things being equal, are higher the greater their job opportunities. So if you want to have children in your society, and lots of men strangely do, they really have to change the deal. And this runs into reminds me of one of the most enjoyable discussions I ever had. I hope it won't shock people here, which is about 30 years ago. No, yes, at least 30 years ago, with a very senior Japanese official who'd been formerly a vice minister in the Ministry of Finance and was then working for one of the American banks. And I said, look, if you look at the fertility rates that Japanese women now have, basically the Japanese nation is going to disappear within a couple of 100 years. The figures are dramatic. And I said, and the reason they're doing this is perfectly obvious, that being a mother is an intolerable social situation in Japan, particularly if you're educated, and they all are. So why don't you actually give up this patriarchal nonsense? Because I came into this bank and every employee was a man except the tea ladies. And he said, well, very difficult. And then I said, so you'd rather that Japan died than give up this ridiculous patriarchal society of yours? And he said, yes, I suppose so. And that is why China is going to die. And so that seems to me a pretty good reason for change. This doesn't work anymore. Once you're in an urban context, the old patriarchal peasant society model is absolutely suicide. And I think that very few people in East Asia, particularly the Confucian societies or South Europe, have got this. Finally, international organizations, future of. So I'm going to put forward three possibilities. The first is that there's enough cooperation between the West and East and enough recognition of global challenges to admit that however difficult it may be, making these organizations really work globally is in their interest. And I think that's still a possibility. It's the sort of thing that people like Janet Yellen would have been talking about, and I think that is still a possibility. The second possibility is that the current international organizations that we're all familiar with essentially become and remain Western plus close allies, which would certainly include India, and China basically leaves it. I mean, it tries to be difficult, but it doesn't have enough voting share to stop it. And it deals with parts of the world it can, and it's part of a competitive environment in which we're competing with the Chinese organizations and the Chinese finance. And a lot of developing countries will find that quite attractive because they can play one side against the other. But when they have to cooperate, it's going to be very messy. So that seems to me the second possibility, essentially competing international organizations. And the third possibility is that the world gets into such a mess that no international organizations can function at all. And that's, of course, what we achieved with brilliant success in the 1930s. And then we're in a completely different world. At the moment, however, I think the choice is between the first and the second. And I'm particularly focusing on the development agencies, the IMF. WTO is really the same story. And whether they will be effective global organizations or become part of a divided world is, I think, still open. India, by the way, as a rising power, sort of semi in the middle, could play quite a large part intellectually and in mobilizing developing and emerging countries to influence, in my view, that outcome. And I don't know how much the Indian government is thinking about this or planning for it, but if it were to be more successful in mobilizing developing and emerging countries, obviously excluding China, who are concerned about this outcome, they might be able to shift the situation significantly, since the West is very interested in its relationship with India right now. And I can't think of any other country that is likely to prevent the sort of mess over vaccination that Hélène so well described. So that seems to me quite a high priority, and because it's also in your interest, for Indian diplomacy. And obviously the price is that your voting share should rise substantially. Of course, so should China's. I have no objection on either side. Unfortunately, some of my compatriots would.
Well, I mean, I'm going to be meeting Junaid later on, so I think this requires extended discussion. But you know, just in a narrow sense, since India is the chair of the G20, I mean, it clearly does provide an opportunity to move the ball a little bit further forward. And we have taken the initiative, the government has, of appointing this committee under N.K. Singh and Larry Summers. According to the newspapers, they have submitted a report. I've not seen it. But like, I mean, one of the tests would be that could the system be worked in such a way for the summit to give some sort of an endorsement, and then that would become a basis for actually moving forward. Because I have no idea what specifically the report says. I mean, it will, I'm sure it will say a lot of general things, but what would be really good is if it is saying some specific things that can be picked up and later on be seen to be a real, at least half a game changer. So we have to see what happens.
I'm pretty sure there will be some quite specific proposals.
Well,
I am reasonably well informed.
Would you like to
No,
tell
I
us?
don't. But some of them are pretty obvious, and they would include enlarging the financial capacity of some important institutions, because it's so obviously essential. It's essential under either of the two possible hypotheses. And Western countries have made a colossal mess on this, and they really have to rethink. And in this respect, this very inward-looking, defensive Biden administration has been really quite a disappointment.
All right. The feast ends here. We still will give you dinner in compensation. For the feast, we really owe it to Martin and to Montek and to Ananth, who is not here. So let us give them a big hand. And Poonam, are there any announcements? Oh, of course. There is an name.
No, so thank you very much. I think, we owe a great debt to all the authors, all the speakers, the chairs of the sessions and discussants, and all of you who have really stayed back. But there is a large team behind this event. I'll not really name each individual person, but I think, in brief, I would like to really thank the NLK team, the IT team, the editorial team, the communications team, the logistics team. I'll not really take individual names because I don't want to really stand in between you and the dinner. We are already late, so thank you very, very much. And the three musketeers, Dr. Poonam Gupta, Praveen Krishna, and Karthik. I wanted to do Karthik, I wanted to read out all the names, but I can't really compete with you. So I really stopped reading the names. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks to Manish.